There's a particular kind of silence that falls over a ranch when something is wrong. It's not the comfortable quiet of a working day winding down. It's the kind of silence that holds its breath, that waits, that knows something is about to break. That's the silence Alina Pritchard walked into on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, and she could feel it in her bones the moment she stepped through the kitchen door. The Riverside Ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of Texas grassland, the kind of place where the horizon seemed to go on forever, and the sky was so big it made you feel small. Alina had been the cook here for just over a year, and in that time she had learned the rhythms of the place. She knew when the hands came in for breakfast at 5 in the morning. She knew the particular sound of James Riverside's boots on the porch, the way he always paused before opening the kitchen door, like he was bracing himself for something. She knew the smell of the land after rain, the weight of the heat in summer, the way the kitchen was the warmest place on the property in winter. But this particular silence was different. It was accusatory. James Riverside sat at the long wooden table where the ranch hands usually ate their meals. He was alone, which was unusual. His foreman, a gruff man named Calvin, typically stayed close during the day, but Calvin was nowhere to be seen. Neither were any of the hands. The table that usually held 8 or 9 men for supper was empty except for James, and he was holding his head in his hands like the weight of it was too much to bear. Alina set down the basket of biscuits she had been carrying and wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron. She had learned not to ask questions. She had learned not to offer unsolicited sympathy. She had learned, through various small humiliations and carefully worded corrections, exactly how much attention James Riverside wanted paid to him, and it was very little. But something in the set of his shoulders, in the way his hands trembled slightly as he raised his head, made her pause. His face was gray, not the gray of age or exhaustion, though he was certainly tired. This was the gray of illness, the particular shade that came when a body was fighting something from the inside out. His jaw was clenched. His eyes, usually a sharp blue that didn't miss much, were glazed and unfocused. Alina's first instinct was to back out of the room and return to her work. Let the man have his privacy. He would tell her if he needed something, and if he didn't, it wasn't her business. She had learned that lesson painfully in her first months here, when she had made the mistake of asking if James wanted extra vegetables at supper, and had been met with a cold stare and the comment that he didn't remember hiring someone to think about his diet. But as she turned toward the stove, she heard him make a small sound, almost involuntary. It was the sound of someone trying not to groan. Alina stopped. She set down the bread basket on the kitchen counter and turned back around. "James," she said quietly, "are you all right?" He lifted his head. His eyes focused on her, and for just a moment she saw something like relief cross his face. Then the shutters came down. His expression hardened into the controlled blankness he always maintained in her presence. "I'm fine," he said. His voice was rough, strained. "The biscuits are good. Make sure there's extra stew for supper. The hands have been working the north pasture all day." Alina knew better than to push. She nodded, turned back to the stove, and began working on the evening meal. She tried to focus on the vegetables she was chopping, on the way the broth was simmering, on the precise temperature of the fire. But she could hear him behind her, his breathing labored, the occasional small movement as if he was trying to get comfortable and couldn't. An hour later, when she set a bowl of stew in front of him, he took only a few spoonfuls before pushing it away. He didn't eat the biscuit. He didn't touch the coffee she poured. He simply sat there, very still, his hands flat on the table in front of him. "Is it the food?" Alina asked before she could stop herself. "If something doesn't agree with you, I can make something different. Broth, perhaps, or something light." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. For a moment, she thought he might actually answer her. Then his face closed off entirely. "The food is fine." "It's not the food." But his tone suggested that he was reconsidering that assessment even as he said it. His hand moved to his stomach and he winced. Alina waited, watching him from her position near the stove. She had learned to be invisible in this kitchen, to work quietly and efficiently, to anticipate needs without being asked. It was a skill that had served her well, but it was also a kind of loneliness. To be present without being seen. To care for someone's comfort while remaining essentially unknown to them. "You should eat something," she said carefully. "Whatever this is, you'll need your strength." He didn't respond. He simply sat there, and Alina went back to her work, but now her attention was split. Part of her was focused on the cooking, on getting supper ready for the hands when they came in. But part of her was listening to the sound of his breathing, to the scrape of his chair as he shifted position, to the way his hands would occasionally clench into fists and then release. By the time the ranch hands came in, dusty and loud and hungry, James had retired to his study. Alina was relieved. She didn't like the way they all looked at her when the boss wasn't present. She didn't like the particular quality of their silence, which felt different from the silence that fell when James was in the room. His presence was cold, but it was a kind of order. Without it, there was a looseness, a testing of boundaries, a way of looking at her that made her want to pull her apron tighter. Calvin came in last, and something in his face told Alina that he knew. Knew what exactly she couldn't say, but he knew something. He met her eyes for just a moment, and then he looked away. "Is the boss all right?" she asked him quietly as she filled a bowl with stew. Calvin didn't answer immediately. He took the bowl and spoon from her hands, and his grip was firm, almost possessive. "The boss is fine," he said. "Why? Did he say something different?" "No," Alina said quickly. "I just noticed he didn't eat much at supper." "I thought perhaps he was unwell." Calvin's jaw tightened. He set the bowl down in front of him and started eating, his movements deliberate, aggressive. The other hands watched him, and Alina could feel the change in the room's atmosphere. Something had shifted. Something was being communicated in the glances that passed between the men, in the particular way they held their shoulders. She kept her head down and continued serving, but her mind was working quickly. There was something happening here, something that extended beyond James's obvious physical illness. There was something in the air, in the way the men treated her now, that felt like judgment, like accusation. After the hands had eaten and drifted back outside, Alina cleaned up. She worked methodically, washing the bowls and spoons, wiping down the table, sweeping the floor. The kitchen was her domain, and when she was cleaning it, she felt some measure of control. Here she could think. Here she was safe. But as she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The question in Calvin's voice when he asked why she had noticed James was unwell. The looks the other hands had given her. The way they had seemed to pull away from her slightly, as if proximity might be dangerous. She had experienced this before in her previous positions. The shifting of loyalty. The sudden coldness of people who had been merely professional. The way small things could be twisted into evidence, circumstantial but damning. An extra portion of salt in the soup, a meal that didn't sit well, a boss who took ill just after being served a particular dish. Alina paused, her hands still in the soapy water. She pulled them out, dried them on her apron, and sat down at the small table in the corner of the kitchen where she took her own meals. It was a simple pine table, scarred from years of use. Alina set her elbows on it and tried to think clearly. James had seemed ill, yes, but she had prepared nothing unusual today. She had made the same stew she made twice a week, using ingredients that had been in the larder for days. She had used the same stock, the same vegetables, the same seasoning. She had tasted it herself as she did every time to check the seasoning and make sure nothing was spoiled. But that detail, she knew, would mean nothing if the men decided it meant something. She had seen this happen before. A cook at the hotel where she had worked previously had been blamed when a guest fell ill, despite the fact that dozens of other people had eaten the same meal without incident. It didn't matter. The guest was wealthy, connected, important. The cook was not. The cook was blamed and dismissed, and her reputation preceded her to her next position, and the position after that, which was how she had ended up at Riverside Ranch, taking a job that paid less than she was worth because no one else would hire her. James Riverside didn't care about her previous difficulties. He had hired her because she was cheap and she didn't talk much, and those were the only qualifications that mattered to him. Alina stood up and returned to her work. She tried to push away the thoughts that were circling like vultures. It was early. James was probably just experiencing a brief illness. It happened to everyone. He would recover, and everything would return to normal, and the tension that had suddenly appeared in the air would dissipate. But even as she thought it, she didn't believe it. That night, Alina lay in her small room above the kitchen, staring at the ceiling. She could hear the wind moving through the eaves, the sound of a loose shutter banging somewhere on the other side of the house. She could hear the occasional call of a night bird, and she could hear, if she listened carefully, the sound of movement in the main house. Someone was awake, moving through the halls. She recognized the footsteps as James's. They were uneven, as if he was having difficulty walking, as if the effort of moving through his own home was exhausting. She heard him go down the stairs, heard the creak of the floorboards, heard him moving to the kitchen. Alina sat up. She was acutely aware that she should stay in her room, should mind her own business, should not get involved in whatever was happening in James Riverside's private life. But she also knew that James Riverside was a man of rigid control, and that control had limits. If he was up in the middle of the night, moving through the house in what sounded like considerable discomfort, something was wrong. She got out of bed, pulling her shawl around her shoulders, and opened her door quietly. The kitchen was dark except for the moonlight streaming through the window, but she could see James in the darkness, standing at the sink, his shoulders heaving as if he was experiencing some kind of physical distress. She struck a match and lit the lamp, and James spun around as if she had struck him. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice sharp despite his obvious weakness. "I heard you come down," Alina said carefully. "I thought you might need something." "I don't need anything from you," James said, and there was something in his tone that stopped her cold. There was anger there, yes, but underneath the anger was something else. Something that sounded like fear. Alina held up her hands in a placating gesture. "I only wanted to help. If you're ill, I could make you tea or prepare some broth, something to settle your stomach." James gripped the edge of the sink. His knuckles were white. When he spoke, his voice was very quiet, and that quietness was more frightening than anger would have been. "I want you to stay away from me," he said. "Do you understand? I want you to prepare my meals in the morning and leave them on the table. I don't want you near me. I don't want to see you. And I certainly don't want your help." Alina felt the words like a physical blow. She stepped back, her hands dropping to her sides. "Of course," she said, "I apologize for the intrusion." She turned to leave, but James's voice stopped her. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow you need to be gone. I'm giving you a week's severance. You can pack your things and leave in the morning." Alina's hand froze on the doorframe. She turned back around slowly. "I'm sorry," she said, though she had heard him perfectly. "You heard me. I don't want you in this house. I don't want you working in my kitchen. You'll pack your things and leave tomorrow, and that will be the end of it." "But why?" Alina's voice came out smaller than she wanted it to be. "What have I done?" James didn't answer. He simply turned back to the sink, gripping the edge again as if it was the only thing keeping him upright. Alina stood there for a moment, waiting, but he didn't speak again. After several long seconds, she retreated to her room and closed the door. She didn't sleep. She lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of what had just happened. One moment she had been doing her job, exactly as she always did, and the next moment she was being fired. One moment James had been treating her with his usual cold indifference, and the next moment he was looking at her like she was something contaminated, something dangerous. She thought about the way the hands had looked at her at supper. She thought about Calvin's question, asked with such careful neutrality. She thought about the silence in the room when she mentioned that James hadn't eaten. They thought she had poisoned him. The realization arrived like a blow to the chest. Alina sat up in bed, her heart racing. They thought she had done something to make him ill. That was why he was suddenly treating her like a threat. That was why he wanted her gone. Not because she was a poor cook, not because her work was inadequate, but because he believed she had deliberately harmed him. Eleanor's mind worked frantically through the possibilities. But I didn't, she thought, her hands clenching in her lap. I did nothing. I would never. There was nothing in the food that wasn't supposed to be there. Nothing spoiled, nothing suspect, nothing dangerous. But it didn't matter. She knew from experience that the truth didn't matter when a story was already taking shape. The story was more powerful than the truth. The story was that the cook had poisoned the boss. The story was that Eleanor Pritchard, the quiet woman who kept to herself and spoke little and asked for nothing, had carefully, methodically, deliberately attempted to harm the man who had given her employment. And once that story took hold, once it had been spoken aloud in the minds of the men on this ranch, there was nothing she could do to change it. Eleanor lay back down, but she didn't close her eyes. She stared into the darkness and waited for morning, and she tried to think of what she would do next. By morning, James had summoned Calvin to the study. Eleanor could hear their voices, low and urgent, though she couldn't make out the specific words. She gathered her things with efficient, economical movements. She had learned long ago how to pack up her life. She had become expert at it. A few dresses, a shawl, underclothes, a brush, a small tin of salve for her hands. That was all she had in the world. It fit into a single canvas bag. Calvin appeared at the kitchen door while she was preparing breakfast. His expression was grim, his eyes hard. "The boss wants you gone by noon," he said. "He's given you 7 days severance as agreed. I'll give it to you when you leave." Eleanor nodded. She kept her hands steady as she continued working, cracking eggs into a bowl, whisking them for James's breakfast even though he would no longer be eating her food. It would be eaten by Calvin, probably, or left on the table and discarded. "Can I ask what brought this on?" Eleanor said carefully, keeping her eyes on her work. Calvin's jaw tightened. "The boss's business is his own. You should be grateful he's giving you a week's pay for violating his trust." There it was, confirmed. He believed it too. Violating his trust, Eleanor repeated quietly. "I have prepared his meals exactly as instructed. I have done nothing but my job." "That's not what he says," Calvin said. "He says he's very ill, and the only thing that changed was you taking over the cooking. He wants you gone, and he's a patient man, but his patience has limits. So you'll be gone by noon, and we'll hear no more about it." Eleanor set down the bowl and turned to face Calvin. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and calm, though her heart was thundering in her chest. "I swear to you on my life that I have done nothing to harm James Riverside. I have not poisoned him. I have not done anything intentional to make him ill. I have done my job, and I have done it well." Calvin stared at her for a long moment. For just an instant she thought she saw doubt in his eyes. But then it was gone, replaced by the certainty that was so much more comfortable than doubt. "That's enough," he said. "You've said your piece. Now finish what you're doing and get your things together. You'll leave at noon." He turned and walked out of the kitchen, and Eleanor was alone again. She finished preparing James's breakfast. She arranged the eggs on a plate, added toast, set it on a tray with coffee and butter and jam. She wanted to add something, some gesture that would communicate her innocence, her good intent. But she knew that anything she did would be interpreted as suspicious. A particular arrangement, a special attention, an attempt to manipulate. So instead she left it plain and simple, exactly as she always did. James came down to eat while she was cleaning up. He looked worse than he had the night before. His face was even grayer, and there was a sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cool morning air. He looked like he hadn't slept. He looked like he was in considerable pain. Eleanor wanted to ask him if he was going to contact a doctor. She wanted to tell him that whatever was happening to him, she wasn't responsible. She wanted to say something, anything that might change his mind or explain the truth. But one look at his face told her it would do no good. His mind was made up. His conviction was complete. He didn't look at her. He sat at the table and ate slowly, mechanically, as if food was a chore rather than a pleasure. Then he stood, set down his fork and left the kitchen without a word. Alina packed her things into her canvas bag. She moved through the kitchen one last time, running her hands over the familiar surfaces. The counter where she had kneaded bread, the stove where she had cooked hundreds of meals, the sink where she had washed countless dishes. She had been happy here, or as happy as she could be given the circumstances. The work was hard, but it was honest. The pay was poor, but it had been enough. And although James Riverside was cold and distant, he had at least been fair in his own way. Until he wasn't. At noon, Calvin appeared with a small pouch of coins. He counted them out into her hand without looking at her, his expression conveying a kind of barely contained anger, as if her very presence was an insult to him. "The wagon leaving town passes near here around 2 o'clock," he said. "You can hitch a ride if you ask polite, or you can walk if you prefer." Alina closed her hand around the coins. Her voice was steady. "I'll walk," she said, "toward town. I can catch a stage from there." Calvin nodded, seemingly satisfied by this answer. He turned and walked away, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Alina secured her bag, took one last look at the kitchen, and stepped out into the afternoon sun. She didn't look back. The walk to town took several hours. Alina moved along the dirt road, keeping to the side to avoid dust from any passing wagons. The sun beat down on her shoulders and sweat darkened her shirtwaist, but she didn't stop. To stop was to give in to the shame, to the feeling that she had done something wrong, and she would not do that. She had done nothing wrong. She had been honest and hardworking, and she had been punished for it anyway, which meant that honesty and hard work were not enough. They never had been, and they never would be. She reached town as the afternoon was turning toward evening. The streets were familiar, but she walked through them as if seeing them for the first time. The general store, the saloon, the church, the small depot where the stagecoach came twice a week. She had noticed these things when she first arrived, but she had been too focused on her work at the ranch to think about them much since then. Now she looked at them with a kind of strange detachment, as if she was already gone, already moving on to the next thing, the next place, the next temporary position that would inevitably end in the same way. She found a boarding house and paid for a night's stay with some of her severance. The room was small and clean, and the woman who ran the place asked no questions, which Alina appreciated. She lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling and waited for tomorrow, when she could catch the stage to the next town. It was late evening when there was a knock on the door. Alina's heart jumped. For a moment she thought it might be James, come to reconsider, to apologize, to tell her he had made a mistake. But when she opened the door, it was Calvin who stood in the hallway, and his expression was grim. "The boss wants to see you," he said. Alina's first instinct was to refuse. She had been fired, dismissed, accused of a crime she didn't commit. She owed James Riverside nothing, and she certainly didn't owe him her time. But there was something in Calvin's voice, some quality she couldn't quite identify, that made her pause. "It's important," Calvin said, as if reading her hesitation. "He sent me to fetch you. He's taken quite ill. The doctor is with him now." Alina felt her stomach drop. Without thinking about it, without really making a conscious decision, she was already reaching for her shawl, already moving toward the door. "What kind of illness?" she asked as they walked back toward the ranch in the darkness. "The doctor's not sure," Calvin said. "The boss has been getting worse all day. Fever, pain in the gut, weakness. The doc thinks it might be some kind of poisoning, but not from the food. Something else." Alina's step faltered for just a moment. She thought about James's words the night before, the accusation implicit in his tone. She thought about the way he had looked at her, like she was something toxic, something that needed to be removed from his vicinity. "Did he tell the doctor what he suspected?" she asked carefully. Calvin glanced at her in the darkness. "About you, you mean?" "Yeah, he did. But the doc was real clear about it. Said it wasn't the kind of poisoning that comes from food. Said it was something else entirely." They walked in silence for a while, and Alina's mind was spinning with possibilities. If James wasn't poisoned, then why had he been ill? What had made him convinced that she was responsible? When they reached the ranch, it was full dark. A lamp burned in the main house, golden and warm. Alina followed Calvin up the porch steps, and he led her not to the study but upstairs, to what she assumed was James's private bedroom. The door was open and light spilled out into the hallway. Alina could see the doctor's silhouette, a portly man with thick side whiskers, and beyond him, James lying in the bed. The doctor looked up when they entered. His expression was complicated, containing several emotions at once: concern, confusion, and something else that Alina couldn't quite identify. Embarrassment, perhaps, or guilt. "You must be Alina Pritchard," the doctor said. "His name is Dr. Brennan, and he's been looking after Mr. Riverside for the past several years." "I am," Alina said cautiously, "though I don't understand why I'm here." Dr. Brennan and James exchanged a glance. It was James who spoke, his voice weak and hoarse. "Alina, I owe you an apology. I made a grave accusation this morning and I was wrong." Alina didn't know what to say. She looked at James, lying in the bed, and she could see the physical toll the day had taken on him. He looked like he had aged years. "What happened?" she asked. Dr. Brennan cleared his throat. "Your cooking had nothing to do with Mr. Riverside's illness," he said. "I've determined that he's been the victim of a slow poisoning, but the poison wasn't introduced through food. It was introduced through water." Alina's eyebrows rose. "Water? The well," Dr. Brennan continued. "I suspected something was amiss when I learned the symptoms Mr. Riverside had been experiencing. I sent my assistant to examine the well this afternoon, and he found something quite disturbing. Someone has been deliberately contaminating the water supply with arsenic. Small amounts, but consistent. It's designed to make someone ill over time, to create the appearance of natural illness rather than obvious poisoning." Alina felt the color drain from her face. That's terrible," she said. "But why would anyone do such a thing?" James closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he was looking directly at Alina, and his expression was full of remorse. "I believe I know exactly who did it," he said quietly. "And I believe I know why. I also believe I made a terrible mistake in accusing you, and I would like to try to make amends if you'll allow me to." Alina's mind was working frantically. She looked at Calvin, and something in his expression told her that he, too, was beginning to understand what must have happened. "I fired Alina because I believed her responsible for my illness," James continued. "I wanted her gone from the house. I spoke to Calvin about it, and I confess I allowed him to believe that I thought she had poisoned me through my food. It was a lie born of illness and confusion, and it was a terrible thing to do to an innocent woman." Alina found her voice. "Mr. Riverside, while I appreciate the apology, I don't understand how you came to realize your mistake or what any of this has to do with me beyond the fact that you wrongly accused me." James was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The reason I'm telling you all of this is that I believe you should know the truth before you make any decisions about your future. And also because I have a confession to make that concerns you directly." Alina waited, uncertain what was coming. "I accused you," James said, "because on some level I was looking for someone to blame. I was ill and frightened, and when I couldn't identify the source of my illness, I fixated on you. You were convenient. You were responsible for my food, which is the most obvious vector for poisoning. And perhaps more importantly, there was someone else at the ranch who wanted me to believe you were responsible. Someone who stood to benefit if you were dismissed." Alina's stomach dropped. "Calvin?" she asked, though she knew the answer. James shook his head. "No, not Calvin. Although Calvin was a tool in his hands, I realize now. The person who poisoned me is my brother Edward. He's been here several times over the past weeks, and he had access to the well. I've been investigating since the doctor told me about the arsenic, and I've found several instances where Edward was here the day after I fell ill with particularly severe symptoms." Alina's mind reeled. "Edward is your brother," she said. "He is," James confirmed, "and he stands to inherit a considerable sum if I die without issue. I have no wife, no children. Edward is my only living relative. If something were to happen to me, everything would go to him." Alina absorbed this information slowly. "So he was poisoning you and he wanted me to take the blame, to be driven away so that I couldn't contradict his story. That's my theory, yes," James said, "though I can't prove it. Edward's word against my own instinct. But what I can prove is that you're innocent, and that I was wrong to accuse you, and that I would very much like to offer you your job back if you're willing to return." Alina looked at James lying in the bed, clearly weakened by his ordeal, clearly remorseful for what he had put her through. She thought about the way his brother had orchestrated events, how he had poisoned James slowly and deliberately, and how he had used her as a convenient scapegoat. She thought about how close she had come to being blamed for a crime she didn't commit, to having her reputation ruined beyond repair. And she realized something. Accepting the job back would not undo what had happened. The damage was already done. The hands at the ranch would still suspect her, even if James claimed she was innocent. There would always be doubt. There would always be the shadow of this accusation hanging over her. She opened her mouth to refuse the offer, to thank James for his apology but declined to return. But then something stopped her. Something in James's expression, in the genuine remorse that played across his features, in the way he was reaching out to make amends. He was different now, she realized. The cold, distant man who had hired her so dismissively and fired her so carelessly had been shaken by his experience. The accusation he had made, the injustice of it, had opened something in him that had been closed before. He was seeing her now, really seeing her, not as an employee to be used and discarded, but as a person, as someone worthy of consideration and respect. "I'll return," Alina said quietly, "but I have some conditions." James's eyebrows rose slightly. "Of course," he said, "whatever you need. First, I want to be present when you speak to your hands about what happened. I want them to hear directly from you that I am innocent, that you made a mistake, and that the real problem is something else entirely. I won't have their suspicion following me like a shadow." "Agreed," James said without hesitation. "Second, I want a raise. My salary should increase by 25% immediately. Not as compensation for what you put me through, but as recognition that I am a valuable and honest employee who deserves to be treated as such." "Done," James said. "Third, I want to know that when I come to work tomorrow, you will treat me with the same respect you would treat anyone else. I will do my job, and I will do it well, but I will not be invisible anymore. I will not be silent." James met her eyes, and in them, Alina saw genuine understanding. "I can agree to that," he said, "though I suspect you'll find I'm a different man than the one you've been working for. This experience has changed me, Alina. It's shown me how quickly power can corrupt judgment, how easily we blame those who are powerless, how important it is to question our own assumptions." Alina wasn't sure she entirely believed him, but she saw that he meant what he said, and for now, that was enough. She turned toward the door and then paused. "There's one more thing," she said. "What will you do about your brother?" James's expression hardened. "I'm meeting with the sheriff tomorrow. Edward will be arrested and questioned. The arsenic in the well is physical evidence, and I have witnesses who can attest to his presence on certain days. It's not a perfect case, but it's enough for the law to take seriously." "Good," Alina said. "I'm glad. He tried to destroy my life to cover up his crime. I'd like to see him face consequences for that." She left James's room and walked back downstairs with Calvin. The foreman didn't speak, but Alina could sense his confusion, his recalibration of the situation. By morning, the whole ranch would know that Alina was innocent and that James's brother was guilty. The story would change, the narrative would shift, and Alina would be reinstated to her rightful place. The thought should have filled her with satisfaction, but instead she felt something more complex. Relief, yes. Vindication, certainly. But also a deep exhaustion, a bone-deep weariness that came from having been accused, dismissed, and then brought back again. She had learned the price of innocence. She had learned that the truth was not always enough. She had learned that one person's change of heart could transform everything, and that one person's malice could threaten to destroy everything. When she returned to the boarding house, Alina lay in bed but didn't sleep. Instead, she watched the darkness gradually lighten to gray, gray lighten to pink, and pink brighten to the pale gold of dawn. She thought about justice and vindication, about the ways that truth eventually came to light, and about the fact that it had taken poisoning, danger, and a serious crime for anyone to really see her, to really acknowledge her value. She thought about James lying in that bed, weakened and frightened, beginning to understand his own complicity in the injustice he had perpetrated. She thought about his brother, sitting somewhere in town, unaware that his carefully laid plans were about to unravel, that the evidence would soon catch up with his crimes. And she thought about herself, Alina Pritchard, the cook who had been accused of poisoning, who had been dismissed and humiliated, and who had stood firm in her conviction that she was innocent. She had not fought back, had not argued, had not tried to prove herself. She had simply waited, and the truth had found its own way into the light. The sun rose over the ranch, over the town, over the vast landscape of Texas. A new day began, full of its own possibilities and revelations. And Alina rose with it, dressed herself carefully, and walked back toward the ranch to reclaim her position, her reputation, and her dignity. What she didn't yet know was that this was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that would involve not only her vindication, but also a deeper understanding of the men around her, the forces that had shaped them, and the strange, complicated ways that injustice and justice could intertwine in a person's life. She also didn't know that James Riverside, lying in his bed, had been thinking about much more than just his brother's poisoning. He had been thinking about the assumptions he had made about Alina, the way he had so quickly believed her capable of such a terrible act, and what that said about his own character. He had been thinking about how he had treated her before the accusation, as merely a servant, a functionary, someone whose presence was so unremarkable that he had never truly looked at her until crisis demanded it. And that realization, that bitter pill of self-awareness, was perhaps more poisonous than anything his brother had slipped into his drink. By the time Alina arrived at the ranch that morning, dressed in her clean work dress with her hair pinned back just as it always was, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The hands who had whispered about her, who had cast suspicious glances her way as she moved through the kitchen, now couldn't quite meet her eyes. Their guilt was a tangible thing, hanging in the air like dust after a stampede. But Alina didn't dwell on their discomfort. She had more pressing concerns. The kitchen had been left in a state during her absence, and she found herself taking inventory with a critical eye. The pantry was in disarray, supplies misplaced, the stove scheduling all wrong. Whoever had attempted to take over her duties had done so with the efficiency of someone who had never actually planned a meal for more than a handful of people, let alone for a ranch of this size. Alina. Calvin's voice came from the doorway, and she turned to find the foreman leaning against the frame, his weathered face thoughtful. "I owe you an apology, more than one actually." She set down the wooden spoon she'd been holding and turned to face him fully. "You do. I should have questioned the accusations more carefully," he continued, stepping into the kitchen. "I should have asked more questions before I accepted what seemed obvious. That's not how I was trained to run things, and it's not the kind of man I pride myself on being." Alina appreciated the sentiment, but apologies, however sincere, couldn't undo the damage of being cast as a poisoner in front of the entire household and half the town. Still, she nodded, accepting what was offered. "What happens to Marcus now?" Calvin's jaw tightened at the mention of James's brother. "The sheriff is on his way out to pick him up. James gave a full statement once the poison was identified. Arsenic, by the way. The kind that's used to kill rodents out here. Marcus apparently bought some from the general store 3 weeks ago. The storekeeper remembers the sale specifically because Marcus seemed so nervous about it, kept looking over his shoulder. 3 weeks, Alina repeated. Before James even became ill, he was planning this for quite some time. Planned it, yes, but he's not exactly clever. Calvin shook his head with something that might have been discussed. He thought he could slip away to Mexico, live on whatever he could scrape together before James died. He figured once his brother was gone, he'd inherit a stake in the ranch, enough to get him started fresh somewhere far from here. Alina moved back to her work, pulling out ingredients for the day's meals with practiced efficiency. The familiar motions were grounding, a return to normalcy that felt like a benediction. Does James know yet about the full extent of what his brother was planning? He's beginning to understand it, Calvin said. The man's had a rough morning with that realization. Might be good for him, actually. Might teach him something about trust and judgment and the weight of his own assumptions. After Calvin left, Alina found herself alone in her domain once more, and the solitude was both welcome and strange. The kitchen had been hers for nearly 2 years before the accusation, and she had cultivated it carefully, made it into something that reflected her standards and her work. But yesterday's violation of that space lingered. Someone had touched her things, moved her tools, second-guessed her methods. By mid-morning, however, as the smell of baking bread and simmering stew began to fill the kitchen, Alina felt something of her confidence returning. This was where she belonged. This was what she did better than almost anyone else on this ranch, regardless of their station. Her hands knew their work, and her instincts about flavors and timing and presentation had never been questioned until yesterday, and they shouldn't have been questioned then. She was in the middle of preparing the midday meal when James appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked terrible. The poison, even in a non-lethal dose, had taken a toll on his body. His face was pale, his movements careful and deliberate, as though he wasn't entirely sure his body would obey him. Alina didn't stop what she was doing. She continued chopping vegetables with the same steady rhythm she'd maintained before he arrived. "Alina," he said, and there was something entirely different in his voice now. Not the confidence of yesterday, not the casual dismissal of before. Something closer to humility, though it clearly sat uncomfortably on him. "I wanted to speak with you." "You're speaking with me," she replied, not looking up from her work. "I made a serious error in judgment," he said carefully. "Several errors, if I'm being honest. I allowed myself to be influenced by my brother's insinuations without stopping to consider the evidence, without thinking about your character or your history here at the ranch." Alina finally looked at him, setting down her knife. "Is there a point to this apology, Mr. Riverside? Because if there is, I'd prefer you make it quickly. I have work to do." He winced at the coldness in her tone, and Alina found she didn't particularly care. He'd had his moment of doubt yesterday. She'd lived in that moment of doubt, had let it crush something inside her. The least he could do was feel some measure of discomfort now. "The point," he said slowly, "is that I want to make this right. I want to offer you a raise in your wages. I want to ensure that everyone on this ranch knows that you were innocent, that you acted with integrity and professionalism throughout this crisis." "A raise," Alina repeated flatly. "How generous. Does that cover the humiliation? Does it cover the way the staff looked at me? Does it cover the damage to my reputation in town?" "No," James admitted. "It doesn't, but it's what I can offer." Alina turned back to her vegetables, her movements sharp now, her frustration evident in every line of her body. "You want to know what bothers me most, Mr. Riverside? It's not that your brother tried to poison you. It's not even that I became convenient as an explanation for something you couldn't understand. What bothers me is how easily you believed it. How quickly you accepted that I, someone who has cooked for you for nearly 2 years without incident, who has taken care of you and your guests and your ranch hands with consistency and professionalism, could suddenly decide to murder you." James was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You're right, I should have questioned it, I should have known better." You should have, Alina agreed coldly. But you didn't, and that says something about how you see people like me. It says something about how invisible I am until I'm convenient to blame for something. He left shortly after that, and Alina was alone again in her kitchen, the silence somehow more oppressive than his presence had been. She finished her preparations for the midday meal with automatic precision, her hands moving through the familiar motions, while her mind churned with thoughts she didn't want to examine too closely. By evening, the entire ranch knew the full story. Marcus Riverside had been arrested by the sheriff and was being held in town pending trial. The poisoning had been confirmed as deliberate, the motive clearly established. The case that had seemed so mystifying yesterday was now transparent, the culprit obvious. And Alina, who should have been vindicated, should have been celebrated for her innocence, found herself moving through the ranch like a ghost, present but somehow still unreal to those around her. It wasn't until 3 days later that something new happened, something that shifted the trajectory of the story in a way that none of them could have anticipated. Alina was in the town proper, shopping at the general store for supplies that the ranch needed, when she ran into Dr. Morrison, the physician who had attended to James during his illness. He was a man of perhaps 60 years, with gray threading through his dark hair and eyes that seemed to miss very little. "Miss Pritchard," he said, stopping her near the dry goods section, "I wanted to speak with you about the incident at the ranch." Alina set down the flower she'd been examining. "Is Mr. Riverside recovering well?" "He is, yes. But that's not actually what I wanted to discuss." Dr. Morrison glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard. "When I was examining Mr. Riverside, I became curious about something. The symptoms he was exhibiting didn't quite match what we'd expect from the dose of arsenic his brother supposedly administered." Alina's attention sharpened immediately. "What do you mean?" "I mean," the doctor said carefully, "that the severity of his illness seemed disproportionate to the actual poisoning. And when I asked him more carefully about the timeline, about when he first felt ill and how the symptoms progressed, something didn't quite add up." "Are you suggesting," Alina said slowly, "that he was poisoned with something else as well?" "I'm suggesting," Dr. Morrison said, "that his brother may not have acted alone, or perhaps not at all in the way we've been told." Alina felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She had been vindicated, had moved past the accusation, had begun to reclaim her position and her dignity. And now, apparently, there was another layer to this story, another mystery waiting to be unraveled. Who else had access to his food? She asked, her mind already beginning to work through the implications. "That," Dr. Morrison said, "is the very question I've been asking myself, and I'm not certain I like where it leads me." Over the next several days, Alina found herself drawn into an investigation she had never sought, working alongside Dr. Morrison, and reluctantly, with Calvin and James himself. They re-examined the timeline of James's illness with more careful attention, mapping out exactly when each symptom had appeared, how severe it had been, what had been consumed in the hours before each progression. What emerged was a picture far more complicated than the simple narrative they'd accepted. There appeared to be two separate poisonings, or perhaps a single poisoning that had been layered, compounded. The arsenic that Marcus had administered was real, but there had been something else as well, something that had exacerbated James's symptoms, something that had nearly killed him. "It has to be someone with access to the kitchen," Alina said one afternoon, reviewing the evidence with Dr. Morrison and Calvin in James's study. "Someone who knew what they were doing, someone with knowledge of herbs or poisons." "Or someone who got lucky," Calvin suggested grimly. "Someone who knew something toxic was being used and decided to add their own layer to it without understanding what they were doing." But Alina shook her head. She'd been watching the ranch hands, the household staff, anyone who passed through the kitchen. She'd been noting who had access to what, who might have had the knowledge or the opportunity. And slowly, a terrible possibility began to form in her mind. It couldn't be. It made no sense. And yet, the more she thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fit together in ways that were both impossible and inevitable. "I need to speak with James," she said abruptly, standing up from the table. "Eleanor," Dr. Morrison began, concern evident on his weathered face. "Are you certain? You've been through quite an ordeal already." "I'm certain," she said, "because I think I know who did this. Or at least, I think I know who might have done this, and it's going to change everything again." The three of them made their way to James's bedroom, where the rancher lay propped up against a mountain of pillows, his color still ashen but his eyes alert. He'd been recovering steadily over the past week, though Dr. Morrison had warned that full recuperation would take months. When he saw Eleanor enter with Calvin and the doctor, James straightened slightly, curiosity flickering across his face. "Miss Eleanor," he said, his voice still rough but growing stronger, "I wasn't expecting visitors. Dr. Morrison, is something wrong? Has there been a development?" Eleanor pulled a chair closer to his bed, her hands trembling slightly as she sat. She could feel Calvin and Dr. Morrison watching her, waiting to hear what she'd figured out. The theory that had crystallized in her mind over the past hours seemed both brilliant and absurd, and she knew that speaking it aloud would transform it from private suspicion into accusation. "Mr. James," she began carefully, "I need to ask you some questions about the days before you fell ill, and I need you to think very carefully about your answers because they might seem insignificant to you, but they could be crucial." James's eyes narrowed with interest. "Of course, ask whatever you need to." "The morning you got sick," Eleanor said, "you told us you'd had breakfast in your room. Toast, jam, coffee, correct?" "That's right," James confirmed. "It was nothing special. Just what I always have when I'm working through correspondence before the day starts." "And who brought it to you?" "Sophie, I believe, or perhaps it was Catherine." He paused, thinking. "Actually, I'm not entirely certain. You know how it is in a household this size. The staff brings things, and you don't always pay attention to which particular person is handling your meal." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. "And did anyone else enter your room that morning? Before you ate, after you ate, any time during those critical hours?" James frowned, trying to remember. "Well, there was. Margaret came in to tidy up. And I believe my brother Marcus stopped by, though I can't recall exactly when. Why does this matter so much, Eleanor? I thought the poison was in my food. You and Dr. Morrison seem to have established that Marcus put it there." "That's just it," Eleanor said quietly. "Dr. Morrison believes there were two separate poisonings, possibly overlapping. The arsenic from Marcus, yes, but something else as well. Something that made your illness far more severe than it should have been. Something that nearly killed you." The room fell silent. Eleanor watched the realization spread across James's face like a ripple across still water. He looked from Eleanor to Dr. Morrison to Calvin as if hoping one of them might contradict her. "That's not possible," he said finally. "No one would. Why would anyone else poison me?" "That's what we need to discover, Doctor," Morrison said, stepping forward slightly. "But Miss Eleanor has an insight she'd like to explore." Eleanor took a breath. The accusation felt enormous, potentially devastating. Once she spoke it aloud, there would be no taking it back, no retreating into comfortable uncertainty. But she'd seen the patterns clearly now, seen how the pieces fit together in a way that made horrible, perfect sense. "I need to ask you something about Margaret," Eleanor said. "Your housekeeper. Has she been with your family for a long time?" James's expression became guarded. "Margaret has been part of this household for, nearly 15 years now. Since before my wife passed, certainly. She's extremely loyal, extremely competent. Why would you? Does she have any reason to dislike your brother?" Eleanor pressed. "Any history with him? Any conflict?" "No, not that I'm aware of," James said slowly. "Margaret keeps to herself, tends to her duties. She has little interaction with Marcus beyond the normal daily requirements of the household." But Eleanor caught something in his voice, a hesitation, the slight upturn at the end that suggested uncertainty rather than genuine confidence. She'd been watching the household for days now, and she'd noticed things that James, isolated in his bed, couldn't possibly have observed. "Mr. James," she said, "I've been observing the kitchen and the household staff very carefully, and I've noticed that Margaret spends time with the herbs. She has a small garden where she grows various plants, medicinal herbs, culinary herbs, and other things as well." "Many people keep herb gardens," James protested. "What are you suggesting, Eleanor? Surely you're not implying that Margaret would." "I'm not implying anything yet," Eleanor said. "I'm asking questions, and I've noticed something else. 3 days before you fell ill, I witnessed Margaret and your brother Marcus having a conversation in the hallway outside the library. They seemed tense. Marcus was speaking in low tones, and Margaret's face was quite flushed. Calvin shifted slightly beside Eleanor, and she could sense his skepticism. But Dr. Morrison was watching her with increasing interest, as if he'd begun to see the shape of her theory. "Do you remember that conversation?" Eleanor asked James. "Or do you remember anything Marcus might have said to you around that time? Anything unusual about his behavior?" James closed his eyes, clearly trying to recall. When he opened them again, there was a new wariness in his gaze. "Marcus did mention something. He said he'd been having trouble with the household staff. He said Margaret had been disrespectful, had refused some of his requests. I didn't think much of it at the time. Marcus is often complaining about something or other." "What kind of requests?" Eleanor's voice was steady, but her heart was pounding. "I don't recall exactly," James said. "Something about his laundry, perhaps, or his meals. Honestly, Eleanor, I still don't understand where you're going with this." Eleanor glanced at Dr. Morrison, who gave her an encouraging nod. She turned back to James. "What I believe happened," she said slowly, "is that Marcus was planning to poison you. He may have even mentioned it to Margaret, or she may have overheard something. And instead of going to you, instead of warning you, Margaret, she added her own poison to the mix." "That's insane," James said flatly. "Why would Margaret?" "Because," Eleanor said, understanding flooding through her as the pieces clicked into final place, "she wasn't trying to harm you. She was trying to protect you. She was trying to make his poisoning visible. By adding her own toxin, something that would show up more clearly, something that would demonstrate that something was wrong beyond just a simple illness. She was trying to ensure that you would seek medical attention immediately, that you would survive." The words hung in the air between them. Dr. Morrison's eyes widened slightly as he grasped the implication. "My God," the doctor breathed. "That would explain the inconsistencies. It would explain why the symptoms were so severe, so much more dramatic than simple arsenic poisoning would cause. If someone deliberately compounded the poisoning with another substance, something that would interact dangerously, but would also make the poisoning unmistakable, it would create exactly the pattern we've been seeing." "But that would mean she was poisoning me," James said, his voice rising with distress. That would mean she was saving your life," Eleanor said firmly. "Because if Marcus had poisoned you with arsenic alone, those symptoms might have been attributed to any number of things. A stomach illness, contaminated food, bad water. You might not have called a doctor at all. You might have thought it would pass. And Margaret, who I suspect has worked with you long enough to notice Marcus's increasing resentment, his talking about needing control of the ranch, his obvious bitterness about being second to you, she might have realized what was happening." Calvin, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. "That's a remarkable theory, Eleanor, but it's built entirely on supposition. We have no evidence that Margaret poisoned anyone. We have no idea what she might have used. And most importantly, we have no actual proof that she was acting to protect James rather than to harm him." "You're right," Eleanor acknowledged, "which is why I need to speak with Margaret. If I'm correct, she'll know immediately what I'm talking about. And if I'm wrong, well, then I'll have made a terrible accusation against a loyal employee, and I'll need to apologize most sincerely." She stood, and though James protested weakly from his bed, Alina was already moving toward the door. She could hear Dr. Morrison following her, and Calvin after him, all three of them descending the stairs with a sense of inevitability, as if they were all being drawn toward a truth that was waiting in the kitchen. Margaret was there, as Alina had somehow known she would be. The housekeeper was working at the large wooden table, preparing vegetables for the evening meal. She was a woman of indeterminate age, perhaps 60, perhaps older, with gray streaking her dark hair, and a face lined with the kind of care that came from years of keeping other people's lives in order. When she looked up and saw Alina, Calvin, and Dr. Morrison entering the kitchen together, her knife paused mid-motion. "Miss Alina," she said, her voice perfectly polite but with an undertone of something that might have been apprehension. "Is something wrong? Is Mr. James unwell? I can bring him tea or—" "Margaret," Alina said gently, pulling up a chair, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. What did you put in Mr. James's food?" The knife fell from Margaret's hand and clattered against the wooden table. For a long moment she said nothing, and the only sound in the kitchen was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then slowly she sank into a chair across from Alina. "How did you know?" Margaret's voice was barely above a whisper. "Because," Alina said, "I've been paying attention. To the household, to the dynamics, to the small details that people often overlook. And I saw something in your face, in your manner, that suggested you knew more than you were saying. So, tell me, what did you use?" Margaret's hands trembled as she folded them on the table. "It was foxglove," she said quietly. "From my garden, just a small amount, mixed with something else to make it more potent but not immediately lethal. I knew. When I heard Marcus talking to himself that day, muttering about how things needed to change, about how Mr. James was standing in the way of progress, I knew what he was planning. I've worked in this household long enough to recognize the signs. I've seen men like Marcus before, ambitious, resentful, capable of terrible things. And you thought poisoning him yourself would stop him, Doctor?" Morrison asked, his tone not accusatory but genuinely curious. "No," Margaret said. "I thought it would save him. If I added something to his food at the same time Marcus did, and I made sure to do it on the morning he was planning his poisoning, the symptoms would be unmistakable and immediate. He would appear so severely ill that no one could possibly ignore it. He would have to call a doctor, and a doctor would find evidence of poison, would understand that something deliberate had happened. Marcus couldn't hide behind accident or misfortune if the poisoning was so obvious, so severe that it required medical intervention." Alina felt a chill run down her spine at the calculation of it, the cold logic beneath the apparent loyalty. "You were risking his life," she said softly. "He was going to die anyway," Margaret replied, meeting Alina's eyes directly. "If Marcus succeeded with arsenic alone, there was a chance, a real chance, that no one would realize what had happened until it was too late. I've nursed enough people through illnesses to know the difference between ordinary sickness and poisoning, but most people haven't. I thought if I made it impossible to miss, if I ensured that the symptoms were so severe and so unusual that a doctor had to be called immediately, Mr. James would have a chance. A small chance perhaps, but a chance nonetheless." Calvin leaned forward. "And did you know about your brother's involvement in this?" Margaret's eyes widened slightly. "My brother? What does Marcus have to—" "Not Marcus," Alina said quietly. "That was my next question. Dr. Morrison, you mentioned that you weren't certain Marcus had acted alone, or that he'd acted at all in the way we initially believed. Is it possible that someone else used the information about the poisoning to their advantage?" The doctor's weathered face grew more lined as he considered Alina's words. "I suppose it's possible. The poison in James's system was clearly arsenic, but the secondary substance, the foxglove you've just described, Margaret, that could have been introduced by anyone with access to the kitchen and the knowledge to do so effectively." "Who else knew about Marcus's plan?" Calvin asked sharply, turning back to Margaret. Did you tell anyone? No, Margaret said firmly. I told no one. I acted alone because I believed it was the only way to protect Mr. James without causing a scandal or confrontation that might push Marcus toward violence. He's a dangerous man, Mr. Calvin. I'm not sure you understand how dangerous. He's spoken of things I've overheard, about wanting to control the ranch, about resenting his brother for having inherited while he was forced to work for a living. If I'd openly confronted him or warned Mr. James, I believed he might escalate his plans. He might attempt something more direct, more violent. Alina stood abruptly, her mind racing. Margaret had acted to save James's life. Yes, but in doing so, she'd also created a situation that could be exploited. A situation where the poisoning was so obvious, so severe, that everyone would be looking for someone to blame. And the most obvious target would be whoever had access to the kitchen. Where is Marcus now? Alina asked, her voice sharp with sudden urgency. In his room, I believe, Margaret said, confusion flickering across her face. He hasn't left the ranch since. But Alina was already moving, her instincts screaming that something was profoundly wrong with the picture they'd been examining. Dr. Morrison and Calvin followed her without question as she climbed the stairs, moving past the second-floor landing toward the wing where the family bedrooms were located. She could hear footsteps behind her, could sense the same growing dread that was making her heart pound. When they reached Marcus's room, Alina knocked sharply but didn't wait for an answer. She pushed open the door and stopped short. The room was empty, not temporarily empty, completely empty. The wardrobe stood open with nothing inside. The desk was cleared of all personal effects. The bed was stripped bare. He's gone, Calvin said unnecessarily, moving to the window. Probably left sometime in the past few days, during the chaos of the investigation. Alina felt the weight of the realization settle over her like cold water. He knew, she said slowly. He knew about Margaret. He knew what she'd done, what she was planning, or at least he suspected it. So he made his play. He poisoned James with the arsenic. And then when Margaret compounded it with the foxglove, when the poisoning became undeniably obvious and medical attention was required, he disappeared. Why would he do that? Dr. Morrison asked, confused. If he wanted James dead, wouldn't he stay to ensure it? No, Alina said, understanding with terrible clarity, because he never intended to stay. He was planning to leave all along. The poisoning wasn't meant to kill James immediately. It was meant to appear as if James might have caused it himself. An accident, perhaps. A suicide attempt. Something that would clear Marcus of suspicion and allow him to flee with his reputation relatively intact. Maybe he took money with him. Maybe he already had plans to establish himself elsewhere. And Margaret's intervention, Calvin said quietly, it actually saved James's life, but it also made the poisoning obvious, made it clear that someone had done this deliberately. Which gave Marcus time to run, Alina finished. Margaret tried to protect her employer, but in doing so, she inadvertently helped his would-be murderer escape. The three of them stood in the empty room, the weight of the terrible irony settling over them like ash. Alina felt exhaustion wash through her suddenly. The past days of suspicion, of investigation, of being blamed and then vindicated and then drawn into deeper mystery, it was all crashing down on her now. We need to inform James, Dr. Morrison said finally. And we need to contact the authorities about Marcus's disappearance. He's a criminal, possibly a murderer, and he's at large. But Alina was barely listening. She was thinking about Margaret, about the woman's cold calculation and her genuine concern for her employer. She was thinking about how good intentions could become twisted and tangled with terrible actions. She was thinking about how the question, who poisoned James Hartwell, had led not to a simple answer, but to layer upon layer of complexity and contradiction. I need to go back downstairs, she said, her voice hollow. Margaret needs to understand what's happened. She needs to know that her attempt to save James's life may have caused him to believe his own brother tried to murder him. She needs to know that the man she was trying to stop is now gone, possibly forever. As the three of them made their way back down the stairs and toward the kitchen, Alina couldn't shake the feeling that they'd uncovered only part of the truth. There were still pieces missing, still questions that demanded answers. And most troublingly, there was the question of where Marcus had gone and what he might do next. The investigation, it seemed, was far from over. It had simply transformed into something far more complicated and far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The kitchen was warm when they entered, almost oppressively so given the chill of what they'd just uncovered. Margaret was exactly where Alina had left her, standing at the large wooden table with her hands submerged in a basin of water, washing vegetables with the methodical precision of someone trying to hold onto normalcy while the world collapsed around her. She looked up as the three of them entered, her eyes moving from Alina to Dr. Morrison to Calvin, taking in their expressions with the keen awareness of a woman who'd spent years reading the moods of her employers. "It's done then," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. Alina hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, but Alina had learned something crucial during this entire ordeal. Margaret was far too intelligent to be treated as an innocent. "We know about the foxglove," Alina said carefully. "We know what you were trying to do. We also know why." Margaret's hands stilled in the water. She didn't pull them out, didn't turn around fully. For a long moment, the only sound was the gentle drip of water back into the basin. "I was trying to save him," Margaret said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "We know," Calvin said, and there was something almost gentle in his tone. "But what you don't know is what you actually stopped, what you actually caused." Dr. Morrison moved further into the kitchen, his medical bag still in hand, and Alina realized he'd never put it down. He'd been carrying it like armor, like evidence of his professional authority. "Margaret, I need you to listen very carefully. Mr. Hartwell wasn't being poisoned by accident. He wasn't being poisoned by Miss Alina. He was being poisoned deliberately, methodically, by someone who was very much aware of what they were doing." Margaret finally turned around, pulling her wet hands from the basin. Water dripped onto the floor, creating small dark spots on the stone. "By whom?" she asked, and her voice had changed. It was harder now, edged with a fury that Alina hadn't heard before. "Your master's brother," Alina said, "Marcus Hartwell." The color drained from Margaret's face so completely that for a moment Alina thought she might faint. She moved instinctively toward the woman, but Margaret held up a hand, steadying herself against the table. "No," Margaret said. "No, that's not possible. Marcus has been nothing but kind too." She stopped, and Alina watched as understanding began to dawn in her eyes. "Kind," she repeated, the word turning bitter on her tongue. "Or simply present, watching, waiting." "He knew you were protecting James," Calvin explained. "We believe he even anticipated it. The arsenic he was using was a slow poison, something that would look like natural illness at first. Your intervention with the foxglove actually forced things to a crisis point more quickly than he intended. It made the poisoning obvious enough that people would seek medical help. It saved James's life, but it also made it clear that someone was trying to kill him," Margaret finished, her eyes widening. "And in doing so, it gave Marcus a reason to leave, without suspicion falling on him." Alina found herself marveling at the woman's ability to follow the logic, even as she was reeling from the revelation. "He's gone," Alina confirmed. "We don't know where yet, but he's disappeared from the estate." Margaret sank into one of the kitchen chairs, her legs apparently no longer capable of holding her weight. Her wet hands dripped onto her lap, darkening the fabric of her dress, but she didn't seem to notice. "I thought I was saving him," she whispered. "All this time, everyone thought I was poisoning him, and I thought I was saving him, and instead I was helping the man who actually wanted him dead to escape." The irony was so brutal, so perfectly constructed by fate itself, that Alina found herself struggling for words. There was no comfort to offer here, no easy reassurance. Margaret had done what she believed was right, had acted from genuine care and concern, and it had all been orchestrated to backfire in the most devastating way possible. "There's more," Calvin said quietly, and Alina shot him a look. What else could there possibly be? Calvin pulled a small leather journal from his coat pocket. "When we were investigating Marcus's room, we found this hidden in the lining of his wardrobe. It appears to be a personal ledger of some kind." He opened it carefully, the pages yellowed with age and filled with cramped, meticulous handwriting. "Entries going back years," he continued, "but the recent ones are particularly illuminating." Dr. Morrison moved closer to read over Calvin's shoulder, and his expression grew darker with each passing moment. "This is documentation," the doctor said slowly. "This is proof of premeditation. Look here, he's calculating dosages, documenting James's health conditions, noting his daily routines. He was planning this for months, possibly years." Alina felt her stomach turn. A year ago, if someone had told her that she would be standing in a kitchen, discussing evidence of carefully planned fratricide, she would have thought them mad. And yet here she was, and the evidence was as solid as the stone beneath her feet. "There's something else," Calvin said, turning to a page near the back of the journal. His voice had taken on a strange quality, something between professional detachment and barely concealed horror. "He's written about you, Margaret." Margaret's head snapped up. "About me?" Calvin hesitated, clearly debating whether to read the passage aloud, but Alina could see the wisdom in transparency. These were the facts that Margaret deserved to understand. "He writes, the cook is protective of James, predictably loyal. When the time comes, she will likely attempt some form of intervention. This is good. Her actions will authenticate the poisoning as deliberate, forcing James to seek medical attention, which will actually accelerate the timeline. Once he recovers, and he likely will, given the relatively modest doses, he will be convinced that Marcus meant to kill him. Suspicion will fall entirely on Marcus, allowing his disappearance to seem like an admission of guilt rather than a planned departure. The beauty of it is that everyone involved will believe they're acting in James's best interests, and yet they'll all play directly into my hands." The words hung in the air like poison themselves. Alina watched Margaret's face as the full weight of what she'd just heard settled over her like a funeral shroud. "He knew," Margaret breathed. "He knew exactly what I would do. He counted on it." "He didn't just count on it," Alina found herself saying, and there was an edge to her own voice that surprised her. "He orchestrated it. He set up a situation where the most caring, loyal, decent action you could take would become the instrument of his escape." "But how could he have known?" Dr. Morrison asked, frowning. "How could he be certain that Margaret would attempt to counteract the arsenic? The man couldn't have had complete control over." "He knew because he'd been watching her," Calvin interrupted quietly. "Because he'd probably been watching everyone. This wasn't a crime of passion or opportunity. This was a crime of calculation. He understood the dynamics of this household, understood the people in it. He knew James relied on Margaret. He knew Alina was new and therefore vulnerable to suspicion. He knew everything." Alina felt her skin prickle. There was something deeply unsettling about the idea of being studied, analyzed, predicted by someone you'd never even met. Marcus Hartwell had known her well enough to set her up for ruin, and she'd never exchanged a single meaningful conversation with him. Where would he go? Margaret asked suddenly, her hands curling into fists on the table. What is he planning? Surely he can't just disappear into the world with the knowledge that James suspects him, that others now know what he's done. "He likely has resources we know nothing about," Calvin said grimly. "Aliases, false documents, money stashed away. Men like Marcus don't undertake crimes of this magnitude without planning their escape routes years in advance." Alina's mind was racing, following threads, trying to understand the architecture of what had happened. "The question isn't where he's going," she said slowly. "The question is whether he's actually left, and whether if he has left it's truly over." What do you mean? Dr. Morrison asked. I mean, Alina said carefully, that a man like Marcus Hartwell doesn't create a plan this elaborate simply to commit a crime and flee. There's something almost artistic about it, in a deeply disturbing way. He's created a narrative where everyone involved becomes complicit in their own destruction. He's taken ordinary people with ordinary concerns and turned them into unwitting players in his drama. That's not the work of someone who simply wants to kill his brother and take his money. That's the work of someone who enjoys the game itself. Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. Then he's still here, she said with absolute certainty. Or he will be back, because he won't be satisfied with simply escaping. He'll want to see how it all plays out. He'll want to know if his plan succeeded. He'll want to witness the aftermath, Alina finished, understanding exactly what Margaret meant. To see his handiwork come to fruition. We need to inform the local authorities immediately, Doctor Morrison said, already moving toward the door. This has gone far beyond a matter of household mystery. We're dealing with attempted murder, conspiracy, and the flight of a dangerous criminal. Wait, Calvin said, holding up a hand. He was staring at the journal again, his brow furrowed. There's a date here, on the final entry. It's from 3 days ago. Alina felt her breath catch. 3 days ago was after the poisoning had become obvious, after Margaret's intervention had forced the crisis. It was after Marcus had supposedly started planning his flight. What does it say? She asked. Calvin's voice was low as he read. The plan proceeds beautifully. Alina has been properly blamed, suspicion is now mounting toward Marcus, and James is recovering as predicted. By the time they realize what has truly happened, I will be long gone. But before I leave this place forever, there is one more thing I must do. One final move to ensure that when the truth comes out, it destroys as much as possible. Margaret has become an obstacle. Her loyalty to James is too absolute. If she survives this with her reputation intact, she will be too effective an advocate for James's recovery and stability. She must be removed from the picture. In a way that makes her involvement in the poisoning seem undeniable. In a way that ensures James can never fully trust her again. By the time this is over, James will be alone, truly alone. And that is when I can return to finish what was started. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of implication that spread outward in all directions. That's a confession, Dr. Morrison said, his voice hollow. That's an explicit statement of intent to further harm both Margaret and James. This journal, we need to get this to the authorities immediately. But Alina was barely listening. She was focused on the last line of Marcus's entry and the implications that came with it. He said, by the time I can return, Alina repeated slowly. Not by the time I've left or as I depart. He said return. That implies he's already here. It implies that there's somewhere he belongs in this house, somewhere he came from, somewhere he might logically return to. Margaret's face had gone very still. His room, she said. Marcus has a room on the second floor near James's chambers. He always did, even as a child. He said he preferred to be close to his brother. Where exactly? Alina demanded. At the end of the east corridor, Margaret said. Adjacent to the library. There's a connecting door between the two rooms. James never uses the library much anymore, and I don't think he's been in Marcus's room since Marcus supposedly left. Alina was already moving toward the kitchen door, her mind racing with the possibilities. But Calvin caught her arm gently but firmly. We're not confronting him without proper assistance, Calvin said. We don't know if he's armed. We don't know if he's still in the house or if he's made his escape and left the journal behind deliberately as misdirection. We need to be strategic about this. But if he's planning to harm Margaret, if he's planning to plant evidence against her, Alina started. Then we get to him before he can, a new voice said from the doorway. Alina spun around to find James Hartwell leaning against the frame, still looking gaunt and weakened from his illness, but with a fire in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He was fully dressed, though his clothes hung loose on his thin frame, and he was holding something in his right hand. A revolver. "Mr. Hartwell, you're not well enough, doctor," Morrison began, but James raised the gun slightly, not in a threatening manner, but enough to indicate that he was serious. "I've spent days lying in bed while my brother tried to kill me," James said quietly. "Days during which I was convinced that my cook was poisoning me deliberately, that the woman who has served my family for 12 years was betraying my trust and attempting my murder. Do you understand what that does to a man, doctor? Do you understand what it feels like to have the world rearrange itself into a nightmare of suspicion and betrayal?" "Mr. Hartwell, James," Alina started, her voice gentle. "I heard the commotion," James continued, his eyes fixed on something beyond the room, beyond the present moment. "I heard voices from my room. I came to the top of the stairs and I heard everything you said, all of it, the journal entries, the admissions, the plan to destroy Margaret, the plan to destroy me by isolation and betrayal." He lowered the gun slightly, his hand shaking. "My brother, my own brother who I trusted, who I allowed to live in my home, who I helped when his own circumstances became difficult, and he repaid me with arsenic and calculated betrayal. We don't know if he's still in the house," Calvin said carefully, using the tone of someone addressing a person in crisis. "We don't know if he's truly dangerous in an immediate physical sense. The authorities—" "The authorities can come," James interrupted. "But first I need to know, I need to see what he's left behind. I need to understand what was really happening under my own roof." He pushed himself off the door frame, and Alina saw the tremor in his legs, the effort it cost him to stand upright. But his grip on the revolver remained steady. "Come with me," James said, looking at Alina specifically. "You and the doctor and Calvin, and Margaret especially. Because if my brother had plans for you, Margaret, then you deserve to be there when we discover exactly what those plans were. You deserve to see that I know the truth about you, that I know you were protecting me, not harming me." The procession that made its way out of the kitchen and toward the east corridor was unlike anything Alina could have imagined. They moved through the halls of Hartwell Manor like explorers descending into a tomb, the afternoon light growing dimmer as they climbed toward the second floor and the east wing. James led the way, still holding the revolver, moving with determination despite his obvious physical weakness. Behind him came Alina, then Calvin and Dr. Morrison, with Margaret bringing up the rear. Her face was a mask, but Alina could see the tension in her jaw, the way her hands were clenched at her sides. The east corridor was lined with portraits, generations of Hartwells staring down with stern expressions and judging eyes. Alina had walked these halls before, but never in such circumstances, never with such a sense of moving toward a revelation that would change everything. James stopped in front of a wooden door that looked identical to dozens of others in the house. Without hesitation, without knocking, he turned the handle and pushed it open. Marcus Hartwell's room was pristine, almost too pristine. It was the room of a man who'd left in a hurry but had taken great care to cover his tracks. The bed was made with military precision. The desk was cleared of papers. The wardrobe doors hung open to reveal empty hangers. But Alina's attention was drawn immediately to the wall beside the wardrobe. There, hidden behind what appeared to be a false panel, was something that made her blood run cold. It was a series of sketches. Drawings, really, but executed with such detail and precision that they were almost photographic in their accuracy. They depicted Margaret in various daily tasks, collecting water, preparing meals, walking through the garden. And beside each sketch was a notation, a date, a time, a record of her movements. He was stalking her, Calvin breathed, moving closer to the wall. He was documenting her routine, her patterns, everything. But there was more. Behind the sketches, Alina could see other papers. Letters by the look of them, but letters that hadn't been sent. Letters addressed to Margaret, filled with accusations, with claims, with lies carefully constructed to appear as confessions. "He was going to frame her," Alina said, understanding with absolute clarity now. He was going to manufacture false confessions, false evidence, false documentation of her involvement in the poisoning. He was going to destroy her systematically, methodically, with the same precision he was using to poison James. James had gone very still, staring at the wall of sketches, the documentation of his brother's obsession with destroying the woman who had remained loyal to him. "He hated you," James said, looking at Margaret. His voice was barely above a whisper. "He hated that you were loyal to me. He hated that you cared. He hated that someone in this house put my welfare above their own interests. That's what drove him to this madness. He couldn't understand it, and he couldn't tolerate it." Margaret moved forward slowly, her eyes fixed on the sketches of herself. Elinor watched her face carefully, waiting for tears, for recriminations, for some display of emotion. But Margaret's expression remained composed, though her eyes had hardened into something cold and implacable. "Where is he?" Margaret asked quietly. "Where is Marcus now?" "That's what we need to determine," Calvin said. But he was examining the rest of the room now, looking for anything that might indicate Marcus's current location. The fact that he left these materials behind suggests either that he departed in greater haste than anticipated, or that he left them deliberately, hoping they would be found and would cause maximum disruption. "Or," Elinor said slowly, a thought forming in her mind that she didn't want to voice but couldn't ignore, "he left them because he's still here. Because he's hiding somewhere in this house, waiting to see what happens next." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. "That's speculation," Dr. Morrison said, but there was an uncertain quality to his voice that suggested he wasn't entirely dismissing the possibility. "Is it?" Elinor asked. She moved toward the window and looked out over the grounds. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the lawn. Everything about Marcus's plan has been about observation and manipulation, about understanding people and exploiting their weaknesses. Why would he abandon that approach simply to flee? Why not stay and continue to manipulate the situation from hiding? Why not ensure that his plan reaches its full fruition? "Because he's a coward," Margaret said flatly. "He plans meticulous crimes and then runs when they begin to unravel. He's proven that much." "Or because he's brilliant enough to understand that the game is more satisfying than the outcome," Elinor countered. "Look at this journal. Look at these sketches. This isn't the work of someone who simply wants money or revenge. This is the work of an artist, in the most terrible and corrupted sense of the word. Marcus isn't interested in the poisoning itself. He's interested in the effect it has on the people around him. He's interested in control through chaos." "We're wasting time," Calvin said decisively. "Whether he's still in the house or not, the authorities need to be informed. We need to search the estate systematically. We need to gather every piece of evidence and ensure that Marcus Hartwell is found and held accountable for his crimes." He moved toward the door, clearly intending to leave and make arrangements, but James held up the revolver, not pointing it at Calvin directly but making it clear that he wasn't finished with the room. "There's more," James said. His voice had taken on a quality that Elinor had never heard before, something between certainty and madness. "There's always more with Marcus. He would never leave things so simple, so obvious. There's something we're missing. Something that would require him to stay." Elinor understood what he meant without needing explanation. She scanned the room more carefully, looking for anything that didn't belong, anything out of place or hidden. Her eyes moved across the furniture, the walls, the floors. And then she saw it. A slight unevenness in the floorboards near the fireplace. A section of wood that was slightly lighter than the rest, suggesting it had been recently removed and replaced. "There," Elinor pointed. James moved toward it immediately, and to Elinor's surprise, he handed the revolver to Calvin before kneeling down beside the boards. He didn't have a tool, so he used his fingers, finding the edges and working them up with obvious effort. Beneath the floorboards was a space, and in that space was a small leather bag. James opened it with shaking hands. Inside were documents, false documents. Alina realized immediately, seeing official-looking seals and signatures that appeared authentic but which she suspected would prove to be fabrications. There were bank documents, transfer records, evidence of money being moved from James's accounts into others. There were letters, written in Marcus's hand but intended to be read as communications from someone else. And there was something else. A photograph. Alina couldn't see it clearly from where she stood, but she saw James's face change as he looked at it. He went very white, and for a moment she thought he might lose consciousness. "Oh God," he whispered. "Oh God, no." "What is it?" Dr. Morrison moved forward, concerned that his patient was having some kind of medical crisis. But James couldn't seem to speak. He simply held out the photograph with a trembling hand. It showed a woman. A woman who bore a striking resemblance to James, but with finer features and a sadness in her eyes that seemed to pierce even through the photograph itself. She was younger in the image, perhaps 20 years old, and she was standing in front of a house that Alina didn't recognize. On the back of the photograph in Marcus's handwriting were two words, "Mother, forgotten." The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Alina felt her mind scrambling to understand the implications, to connect the threads that were suddenly visible before her. "James," Alina said carefully, "who is this?" "I don't know," James whispered. "I don't know who this is." But Alina was beginning to understand, and the understanding was terrible. "Your mother," Calvin said quietly, having apparently reached the same conclusion. "This is a photograph of Marcus's mother, someone James didn't know about. Someone who? Someone I had forgotten," James finished, his voice hollow. He stood abruptly, still holding the photograph, and moved to the window. "Or someone I never knew. Father took another mistress while Mother was alive. There was a child, a boy. I was young. I don't think I even knew his name. Father made sure we were separated, that Marcus and I never." He stopped, and Alina watched understanding dawn on his face with the force of a physical blow. "He's my brother," James continued slowly. "My actual brother. Not by the same mother, by the same father. And he spent his entire life believing that I knew about him, and that I didn't care. That I was content to live my comfortable life while his mother suffered," Margaret said quietly. She too was looking at the photograph now, and Alina saw the flash of something in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. "You knew," Alina said to Margaret. It wasn't a question. Margaret nodded slowly. "I suspected. Years ago when Marcus first came to the estate, he was asking questions about the family, about your parents, about whether there were any other children. At first I thought nothing of it, but his questions were very specific, very detailed. And there was a bitterness to them that suggested personal knowledge rather than idle curiosity." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Calvin asked. "Because it wasn't my place," Margaret said simply, "and because I didn't know the entire truth. I only knew that Marcus seemed to have some sort of claim on this house, some sort of grievance. I assumed that eventually it would come to light if it was important enough. It was important enough for him to spend years planning his revenge," Alina said quietly. She was beginning to see the complete picture now, the entire architecture of what Marcus had built. It wasn't about money. It was never about money. It was about making James suffer. It was about making him understand loss and abandonment and betrayal, the way that Marcus had experienced those things his entire life. She moved toward the window and looked out at the darkening landscape. Somewhere out there, Marcus Hartwell was either fleeing or hiding. Either way, he had succeeded in his primary objective. He had poisoned James,